Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Alicia, what's your view of this question of how much these trends are due to local decisions and local prosecutors versus state policy? Because one thing that Governor Gavin Newsom might say in his defense is, I'm not the guy is sitting in the prosecutor's office in L.A. or San Francisco. On the other hand, he has a pretty big bully pulpit. And to use Florida again as a contrast, Governor Ron DeSantis there has ousted a couple local prosecutors in Florida. They're called state's attorneys. One of them was the guy in Tampa, Andrew Warren. And when he was suspended by DeSantis in the summer of 2022, DeSantis said one reason was neglect of duty. And the order from the governor said that Mr. Warren had a policy of, quote, presumptive non-enforcement for certain criminal violations, including trespass at a business location, disorderly conduct, disorderly intoxication, and prostitution, as well as certain cases of resisting arrest without violence. For example, fleeing from a law enforcement officer. And so, Alicia, that suspension was challenged by Mr. Warren, and his lawsuit was thrown out by the Florida Supreme Court, as I recall. And I don't know whether Governor Gavin Newsom has a similar sort of power under California law, but certainly he's the governor of the state. He can command a lot of attention and a lot of pressure, political pressure, public pressure. And it seems to me that if he wanted to change some of these policies and make the argument against some of these local prosecutors, he certainly could weigh in.
Gavin Newsom has come out and said these smash and grab robberies must end, and he's made very strong statements about these issues, which is a little bit like, politicians going out and saying, well, Hamas must stop killing Israelis, right? He can make all these kinds of statements, but unless they're actually backed up with any kind of force or policies, it really doesn't do much. And part of the problem is, to go back to 2014, was George Soros backed constitutional amendment Prop 47 that, as I mentioned earlier, essentially decriminalized a lot of offenses, drug use and larceny of less than $950. And that helped create this kind of atmosphere of public disorder and this feeling by a lot of criminals that they could get away with things, this feeling of impunity. But the other problem was that a lot of these people who are committing these crimes, they are on drugs. They have drug addictions. Many of them also have mental illness. There was a mentally ill person who actually assaulted Governor Gavin Newsom back in 2021 when he was on actually a campaign trip in Oakland. Actually, Barbara Boxer was also mugged the same year in Oakland, and that's the former California senator. And so a lot of these people who are committing these crimes are mentally ill or drug addicts or both. And what Prop 487 did is what a lot of the courts used to do is that they would give people an incentive to enter into rehab or get treatment by essentially leveraging criminal penalties. Now, the problem is what Prop 47 did, and again, I just want to underline, Gavin Newsom, when he was lieutenant governor at that time, was one of the biggest supporters of this initiative. What Prop 47 did is really handcuff local law enforcement and local localities who wanted to be able to push these criminals, but really people who had, again, severe mental illnesses or drug addictions into getting treatment. Now they really can't. One other issue, and this goes back to Governor Jerry Brown's administration about 10 years or so ago, was the courts essentially ordered the state to reduce its prison population because they were overcrowded. The prisons were overcrowded. And again, it was an overreaching order on the consent decree by the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit is to blame for so many dysfunctions in California and actually along the West Coast in general. But they essentially ordered this to reduce its permanent colonial population. What the state did under Jerry Brown has continued to do under Gavin Newsom is to push state prisoner people who would usually go to state prison down to local jails. And then as a result, the local jails are getting filled up. And so then that's another reason why oftentimes when even police arrest people, they just let them back onto the streets because they don't actually have any room in the jails for them. And so there are a couple things that the state could do to solve these issues. It could expand state prisons, but obviously that's very unpopular among the left. It could actually reduce the benefits that it pays to prison guards, who are among the highest employed public employees in the state. And that could free more money in the budget to house more prisoners. But again, that would alienate the government unions. And so there are several things that the state could do, or Governor Gavin Newsom could do, to get around this Ninth Circuit consent decree in order to, we don't exactly want to go back to the times where you're just kind of locking people up just because they have mental illnesses. But there needs to be some kind of penalty and punishment for these crimes. And right now there isn't. And that's the problem.
The other argument we're sort of circling around, Kim, is kind of a broken windows theory argument that these lines that we're talking about on these charts, violent crime and property crime, they're connected. And that when local prosecutors and states allow low-level crimes to continue unimpeded, they're creating an environment of disorder. So one of the local prosecutors that was suspended by Governor DeSantis in Florida reportedly dropped charges against a 19-year-old. These were drug charges. And that 19-year-old later allegedly went on a shooting spree. And I can only imagine there are more examples like that in these cities and in these states. And even things like shoplifting, if you create an environment in which shoplifting up to a certain threshold is basically not prosecuted, it seems to me that you're creating an environment in which you're making it much more likely that a local shopkeeper, a guy running a bodega or a convenience store, is more likely to get assaulted or stabbed or something like that if he is trying to stop the shoplifting of his store that is ruining his business. So it's not as if these property crimes don't sometimes turn into actual violent crimes.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And if you drill into this case of the Orlando prosecutor that DeSantis removed from office, her name is Monique Worrell. You listed the case of a man whose charges were dropped. He had a criminal record. He went on to kill 3 people, including a young girl. But there was another case that was cited as similar, in which there was a man who she chose not to go after, who then went on and shot and injured 2 police officers in the Orlando area. And it was very illustrative when DeSantis focused in on this particular prosecutor, as well as one in Tampa who was removed, and looked at their record, demanded it go out so that people could see what had happened. And yes, the amount of efforts that these prosecutors took to somehow avoid charging people with, for instance, gun and drug trafficking offenses, or in one case, child pornography offenses. And the argument all along as well, are these really, like the drug trafficking, is this a crime against a person? This has always been the argument of liberal prosecutors. Well, it doesn't really hurt anybody. But your point, Kyle, is all important, which is that we sometimes call these crimes, you might call them property crimes or lesser crimes. Alicia used the term when she was talking about California petty crimes, but they are often the gateway crimes to much larger crimes. And we've known this for a long time. The United States began to suffer from a rise in crime in the 60s and the 70s, and it stretched into the 80s. And one of the things that was so important around the end of that period, when things finally began to get better in the 90s, was that we did understand the broken windows theory, finally, of policing, which is that, if you're going to allow a little bit of disorder, it tends to spiral into a great deal of disorder. And there was a backlash against that coincided with 2020 and this burst of protests and crime out there. And unfortunately, the marrying of those two things, this new wave of crime and everybody also dismissing what we'd known, is what's got us back to the situation. What's mesmerizing is that there are places that, even though they know the answer to this, how to fix it, because you can look at states that have, like Florida, made those numbers go back down, that it's still crazy to me that there are places that just won't take the basic steps necessary to get this under control.
Alicia, we'll give you the last word, but Governors Newsom and DeSantis have agreed to a debate on Fox News next month in November. And no doubt a big chunk of their time will be spent on their respective economic records. Gavin Newsom has been feisty about defending California as the center of American innovation, the home to Silicon Valley. But it would be fascinating also to hear them discuss these trends in public safety. And one of these guys we already know is running for president in 2024. That's Ron DeSantis in the Republican primary. Gavin Newsom has said repeatedly that he is not running for president, but is there any doubt in your mind, Alicia, that he is trying to lay the groundwork for a future campaign, maybe in 2024, if President Biden decides to bow out eventually, or maybe in 2028 or thereafter?
I don't think there's any doubt. I think he's still planning to or hoping to run in 2024. And I think that some of the latest indications are based on some of the bills he signed and bills he vetoed that actually get to this issue of public safety and public disorder. For instance, he vetoed a bill that would have legalized psychedelic drugs. He also vetoed a bill that would have legalized kind of Amsterdam pot cafes. He signed a bill that would have strengthened conservatorship laws that would have allowed family members to take conservatorship of mentally ill members of their family and to compel them into treatment, which was opposed by the progressive base of his party. He's also petitioned the Supreme Court to take up a case that the Ninth Circuit decided that essentially created a right to vagrancy under the Eighth Amendment. And he has been pushing this drive to overturn this Ninth Circuit opinion to allow cities like San Francisco to actually remove homeless people from the streets or force them to remove themselves. So I think he, just by these latest actions, you could infer that he realizes that the public safety issues in California and especially places like San Francisco are a political vulnerability. And so he's trying to actually, in a way, correct and rectify his own record through these latest actions.
Thank you, Alicia and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.